what the EUDR delay means and how to prepare in 2025. I'm joined by an expert group of panelists here, SVP of Product, John Carls. I'm also joined by Juliette Barre, VP of Partnership here at Sourcemap. And my name is Sam Dejoie. I'm the Senior Policy and Government Affairs Analyst here at Sourcemap, and I'll be moderating this session. Again, any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But I think the best way to kick this conversation off is to go over the EUDR. Why is it potentially being delayed, and what does that mean? So, from a policy perspective, I think it's pretty safe to say now that EUDR is somewhat controversial. It's been getting some pushback from industry and producing countries that are providing the EU with a lot of its raw materials and commodities. But also, in addition to those two, we've been seeing a lot of pushback from member states themselves, EU member states, and the competent authorities there, so the customs authorities. And so what has happened now, the EU Commission feeling this much pressure, last week we actually saw in the EU Parliament under what's called the urgency procedure, the EU Parliament fast track a vote for the delay of the EUDR by 12 months for November 6th, which is next week. This is a big deal because one of the last times I remember that the EU the EU Parliament used the urgency procedure was actually for COVID measures and implementing policies in an emergency way there. So I think that shows that the EU is pretty serious about this delay, and from our perspective, it looks like it's all but certain that they will be delaying the implementation of the EUDR by 12 months. So instead of an enforcement date of December 30th, 2024, we're looking at December 30th, 2025. So with that background, I think maybe we can kick it off to Juliette just to start this conversation off. You're having discussions with companies all across the globe, EU, Asia, the Americas. And I'm interested to hear your perspective on how different industries are thinking about the potential delay to the EUDR, what the 12-month delay means, and sort of what are the major roadblocks we're seeing, at least from the industry.
Yes, thanks, Sam. So I think what was surprising and not surprising, speaking with everyone on the EUDR, is even though the delay is, very likely to be signed and agreed upon, no one decided to reduce their efforts. All industries, everyone we're talking to, are very much focused on still moving forward in preparing themselves to comply, whether it's by the end of the year or within 12 months. So by industry, I think everyone agrees to that. What we're looking at and seeing more is some industry have been more prepared. So food and ag, people in the cocoa and coffee space usually have started a little earlier this year already getting prepared, versus what we're looking at for more industrial or supply chains, CPG, furniture are a little, not all, but a little more behind, and then trying to understand with their suppliers what's the lift really that they need to do. The shift we really saw, even with our current customer or people we're talking to, is moving a little more on how to create a due diligence statement, which was needed, would be have been needed by the end of this year, to how do we make sure all the suppliers that I source from, whether I'm an importer or even if some of our customer or people we talk to are traders or operator exporters, how do we make sure that our suppliers are ready to comply? Because what we really noticed working with our customer is not all industry is ready or all suppliers know what they have to do. Some suppliers we dealing with or our customer are dealing with didn't even know what a polygon was until probably until they heard about Sourcemap and their customers started to ask them questions. So I think that's the discrepancy we're seeing. It's mostly the maturity of suppliers in terms of geospatial data. And then the second is the maturity of customer and suppliers also around traceability, being able to know which of their products are in scope, how do I make sure I can collect all the right information for specific shipments, because I will need it for due diligence statements. And the last part, which, from a delay point of view, there's a good news, bad news. Great, you have 12 more months potentially to comply, but the reality is the EU also released their implementation guidelines as well as an FAQ, which gave a lot more understanding of the expectations from the EU. Which was a lot of people were waiting for that. And what we're looking at is a much more strict implementation. That's what people expected, especially around one part is the legality assessments and what is required from companies in terms of their due diligence. And then the other is how they're going to enforce the law, especially for importer and exporter. For example, we've learned that there will be a form where the due diligence receipt number, so once you have submitted a DDS, will be required on the customs form for import and export. That wasn't necessarily very clear before the implementation guidelines. And so I think now that people start to understand that, there's a much more discussion, even from an IT point of view, how do you have a system in place that is robust? And so I think that's why companies, even though they have potentially 12 more months to implement, they're really seeing as this is a very strict regulation, and there really needs to have processes in place. It's not just about collecting data from suppliers. It's something that's really will impact their operations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a lot we will return to there. But John, just to build off of that, Juliette spoke to sort of the increased enforcement that is likely to see from these custom authorities. But given that they may have more sophisticated customs procedures, audit checks, things like that, how are we thinking about a 12-month delay, and what internal processes should companies have in place before the actual enforcement date?
So I think the first thing is to make sure that your suppliers are technically ready to provide the data for the due diligence statement. We certainly see a wide range of capabilities from suppliers, some who are very savvy with geospatial data and some that have absolutely no understanding of geospatial data. So with this delay, it's a great opportunity to assess the supplier's ability to comply with the geospatial data requirements, and then put in some mitigation steps if you identify suppliers who are unable to provide the right data that's going to be required by the registry. And so, part of our solution, as well as the process, is about verifying the data that suppliers already have and identifying those suppliers who need help and giving them some guidance on how to better provide the information that the registry is asking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about supplier engagement, I think we've been getting a lot of questions sort of around the turnaround time. So let's say one of your suppliers has incorrect geospatial data. We know that EUDR allows for a 72-hour amendment process to a due diligence statement. So Julia, in your experience, what is the turnaround time between companies collecting the information requirements from suppliers and ultimately producing a DDS? And if there's a hiccup there, how much time do they really have?
Yes, so I think there is two pieces to that question. There is the technology part, which is where Sourcemap from a system point of view plays a part. So between the time a supplier uploads the data, let's say they have all the right data, right, the geolocations and everything, it will take us between 30 seconds to 10 minutes, depending on how big is the size. As we know, suppliers are allowed to share information in excess. So if they have 10,000 polygons for certain farms or forests versus a few hundreds, that's for us from a system point of view, how long it would take to check the data is valid, meaning no point in the middle of the oceans or a weird shape, which we know the EU, based on our testing, is going to check for the geolocation, the geospatial data quality. Then the deforestation analysis. If all goes well, we will automatically submit a due diligence. So the whole process would be between 30 seconds to 10 minutes if it's pretty heavy, if there is no flag. I think the reality, though, based on, exactly like what John said, there is a lot of various maturity from suppliers, first on even knowing what geospatial data is or even having it. So will they have that data that they can upload right away in Sourcemap first? Then the second is of what quality. It's very common. We've been, doing mapping and polygons and collecting farm data for a very long time. And it's not uncommon to have a good amount of the first time you're doing it, bad data. And so that's why our software will automatically give feedback to suppliers. And we also have a full support team that is here to support and help them navigate that. But I think the challenges for company is understanding what's their baseline and the maturity of their suppliers, and helping them get there. The second is if they don't have that data yet, you need to give a bit of room and to your suppliers to map their supply chain so that they can have that geolocation for the farms and forests that they're sourcing from. So I think that's where we're seeing the challenges more than from a system point of view. And like you said, they have people that import, or they have to create the due diligence statements. They have to have the due diligence statements and the receipts from it before they import or before they export or put something on the markets. So that's what they have to do, and they have 72 hours to amend it if they made a mistake. But the reality is, for some of their suppliers, it might take more than that, more than a few days to be able to answer. What we've seen many of our customers starting to do is requiring in their contract with their suppliers, as of now, like renegotiating contracts to have that supplier must provide that information, especially for the imports, 4, 6, 8 weeks before the shipment leaves. It's a bit challenging for some industries, but that's what we're seeing as a best practice that people are starting now to make sure suppliers are aware and are ready, and for customer themselves to or companies that are importing to protect themselves.
And with all those processes in place, you still have to consider the volume of due diligence statements that any given company, based on multiple roles, right? You could have a company that's both a trader, operator, etc. Maybe Juliette and John, you guys can both tackle this, but in terms of volume, how many due diligence statements do you think any given company could be producing a year? And then, why is automation essentially necessary for these processes?
I can take the first stab at this. So it is going to vary on the company's logistics and procurement processes. But I would say anyone who's doing a relatively high volume is going to want to automate this process. For those familiar with the registry capabilities, there is a manual interface that every company has access to that's registered. They also have an API. We believe that most companies will want to automate the submission of due diligence statements and not require any kind of manual entry, both because the volumes are going to be unsustainable. You don't want to have a team of people manually entering data in addition to the fact that you don't want to run the risk of manually entering mistakes, so fat fingering a field and putting in the incorrect information. The approach that we've taken, and what I think is important, is tying the due diligence statement more closely to your procurement and shipping processes. So we initiate the request for information from suppliers from an order or an order identifier. And that way, our customers are going to have better visibility into the goods that they're purchasing from their suppliers and those suppliers' ability to comply and generate a due diligence statement. You want to be able to clear the order to know that the goods that are, in the case of import, the goods that are coming into the EU are actually deforestation free, and you don't have any risks that that product is going to be, or that shipment will be audited and fines imposed for it. So having that transaction level traceability and visibility is really, really important, especially as the volumes go higher, the more important that automated process becomes.
Just
Yeah.
to build on what John is saying, to give you numbers of what we've seen our customer in terms of volume, what are we talking about, and even other people we talk to. What we're seeing as a range for import, for example, is about between 5,000 to 30,000 imports per year. So already like trying to imagine that, entering that manually would be pretty challenging for anyone, even with spreadsheets. But even more when we're looking at people that are in the realm of trader or exporter. And this is where the volume is really even more exponential. What we're looking at as a range here from estimates of our customers, their exposure, it's more around 10,000 to 700,000 DDS a year. And that volume cannot be done, absolutely not on any way manually. And so that's really where the automation is key. And the automation within Sourcemap and the traceability, but also meaning integrating with any of our system of our customer would be required, whether it's your ERP or else to really automate that process, remove the manual errors, but also just the workload for anyone that would be way too much.
And speaking about roles, trader, operator, etc. John, when a company has multiple roles, what is the easiest process? I know at Sourcemap we have multiple workflows different for trader, etc. But what is the easiest way that a company can streamline that process so that they're collecting essentially, the same standardized information, but can do it in a timely manner and in an efficient manner?
Yeah, so I think this is where some of the challenges with the registry interface present themselves, because they're expecting a due diligence statement to be created at the time when you've logged into the system. But there's quite a bit of data that needs to be collected and thought that needs to go into what data needs to be collected prior to actually submitting the due diligence statement. So we see some complexity in both the import flows and even domestic and export flows. On the import side, we have customers and have talked to prospects who have an offshore manufacturing process where they're collecting polygon and point data from suppliers, shipping those goods to a location outside of the EU, performing some sort of manufacturing process against those goods, and then ultimately shipping those goods into the EU. And in that case, they need to collect the geospatial data ahead of time and actually track where that geospatial data is being used in their manufacturing process. So when they ultimately generate the due diligence statement, they can actually tie it back to that producer level information. So that's not something that the registry actually supports directly, and a process that companies are going to need to manage on their own. Domestically, you have a similar challenge, but you're using slightly different data. So if you're purchasing goods that have already been imported into the EU, then when you submit your due diligence statement, you need to submit those due diligence statement reference numbers and the associated validation references. And then again, you have to collect this information from those suppliers potentially at an earlier point in time, store those, and then when you're ready to submit the due diligence statement, you need to reference those old due diligence statement references. And I think a lot of companies think, well, that should be a fairly straightforward process. But again, at the high volumes, you're talking about potentially tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of due diligence statement references, in which case you really need an automated system for tracking those and being able to associate them to a due diligence statement that you submit to the registry.
Yeah, absolutely. It is quite a process. And we are talking a little bit about pre-screening here, at least what we refer to internally. But before we touch on that, maybe we could just go through really quickly our deforestation analysis process, how we do it. So we're already testing the suppliers beforehand, ahead of the date of enforcement, making sure not only that, they are deforestation free, but also, risk assessment is good, legality assessment is good. But maybe we can start with the deforestation analysis and how we conduct that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're collecting the geospatial data directly from the suppliers. So suppliers will submit the geospatial data that they have to our system, and then we're going to perform a number of checks against the data they submit. The first step of checks is a validation. that just ensures that the data that they're submitting can actually process and analyze for deforestation. So we're looking for things like, is it the right file type? Or if you're submitting polygons, are the geometries structured correctly? But we're also doing some business rule level validation to ensure that it's these polygons actually represent farms or plots on a piece of land. So, for example, we might check if, as Juliette mentioned earlier, we might check if this polygon is located in a body of water, or if it's actually on land, or if the polygon is exceedingly large or implausibly large that it can't possibly be a farm, or implausibly small, in which case it can't possibly be a farm. Or if there's some irregularities in the shape, they could be too uniform, for example. So that's clearly someone who's actually drawn a shape by hand, for example, or used a computer to draw the shape rather than actually identifying the perimeter of the farm. So we do a lot of these business checks to make sure that these are actually polygons that represent actual farms that are relevant for deforestation. And once those checks are passed, those validation checks are passed, we're then analyzing it for deforestation. And in the deforestation check, we're making sure, one, that it validates against the EU Observatory data set. So that's the data set that the EUDR, like the official data set that they presented to us. And we can maybe talk a little bit later about some of the challenges we've seen with that. But we're also checking it against other data sets, industry recognized data sets that give us a better picture of whether the deforestation that's detected is real or not. And we have algorithms that determine, based on a number of factors, whether or not the deforestation flags that we see from those data sets are real, and whether we would consider them a risk as far as EUDR is concerned, and whether they should be submitted ultimately in a due diligence statement.
Why don't we discuss the overflagging issue of the EU maps? Actually, I think that's a good point for our customers to, or excuse me, our audience to hear here. Why is it overflagging, and what is the solution there?
Yeah, so the first iteration of the data set published by the EU Commission, we've done extensive testing against it. And in our initial tests, and also based on historical experience that we have, we noticed a high rate of flagging for deforestation. So as we sort of peeled back the layers and dug in deeper to the problem, we discovered that actually the observatory had published reports that the false positive rate was quite high on this deforestation data set that they were using. That's obviously problematic if they are using this to determine if there's deforestation for the polygons or points that are submitted in a due diligence statement. Having said that, we do know that they're going to update that data set. So we expect sometime in the future, we don't think we know when, we will see a more up-to-date version of that deforestation data set. But they also recommend to use alternative data sets to make sure that for the polygons, that even if it is flagged for deforestation, you can prove that deforestation isn't present using, again, another deforestation data set that's industry recognized. So that's the way we're approaching it. Is we're trusting that the data sets are accurate, but we're verifying that, and we're using alternative data sets and additional maps to actually verify and prove, in the case where there is a false positive, that deforestation really isn't present in the data that's submitted by the supplier.
Yeah, very interesting. The overflagging could be a big issue, but glad we have systems in place where we're already incorporating some of the guidelines and additional information we've gotten out of the FAQs on that part. But Juliette, so it's all nice and well if we can collect that polygon data and analyze it for deforestation, but what happens if we're actually not even able to or a customer or a company is not able to actually collect the polygons in the first place? What are the mitigation efforts that can be done there?
Yes, and I think, again, when back to your first question, right? We're really seeing different maturity of the customers' direct suppliers having access to that kind of information. In food, tend to have it a little bit more. I think for wood, for rubber, we see a little bit less maturity in the suppliers. So I think that's why it's very crucial for any companies to start having a baseline now and asking their suppliers, do you even have that data? Um, and then the second step, as we said, is the data valid? But even just the baseline of, to your point, like what do you do, especially if you're an importer and you don't have your suppliers don't have that data. So there's a few ways we've seen, our customer leverage Sourcemap. You can work with your suppliers. We have a toolkit and enablement on how they can get that information. Another way would be to map your upstream supply chain. So instead of asking just your direct suppliers who you purchase good from, you can map the N tiers, so tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, down to the co-ops, the farms, the management unit, depending on the supply chain you've had. So mapping all the tiers to identify. You have a bit of time to do that. Again, when we're looking at more the full flow at scale with the volume of due diligence statements that you will have to provide, you will for sure want to ask your direct suppliers. But in the meantime, as you're having time, you can start to get in touch with your upstream suppliers to map down to farms. So that's one way to educate everyone. There's also free apps and again, the toolkits that are available to empower and build capacity for your suppliers to map those supply chain. The second thing, as I said earlier, is many of our customers are just really putting that in their contract with their direct suppliers to be able to make sure that by a certain date, their suppliers will have that information, and giving suppliers a few months. One of our customers is even planning to renegotiate contract around summer. So basically, they're telling now their suppliers doing this baseline assessment, enabling them, building capacity, but the deadline for them is by June. If you're not able to do that, we won't be able to contract further with you. So it's a very different mindset, and it means it's not just about technology, it's also about processes and how you purchase and source goods in general. It's really shifting how companies are approaching it. We're here with our team to provide the tools, the best practices, toolkits, helping suppliers. We have a team that speaks, 8 different languages that really here to support, because your suppliers might not speak English, or they might not, be located in Europe or in the US. They may be all around the world. So we have a team that's really enables them and engage with them and support our customer. But really, being able to map is crucial, and genuinely customer won't be able to buy goods if they can't have that data. So it's not like a nice to have. There's no way around it. Due diligence statement for importer for goods that have been imported in the market. The EU registry won't accept due diligence statement that don't have geolocation. If you're a trader or an exporter, you may reuse due diligence reference number. So it's a bit of a different story. But for importers, polygon geolocations, GPS point for farms below 4 hectares are going to be mandatory. And so I think it's really working with the industry, working with the suppliers is going to be very key here to make it happen. And that's why the 12 months is great. It gives you a bit more time, but you need to start now, because again, some suppliers really have no idea.
Yeah, absolutely. It's becoming a part of business. So before we close out the conversation and turn to the Q&A, I think, John, could you explain what a software solution can address or fix in a company's due diligence process, and what needs to be corrected through supplier engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that this software solution can do is verify that the geospatial data that you're collecting is correct and can be ultimately submitted in a due diligence statement. That's probably the most obvious example of what software can fix. You want to make sure that that's all in the right format, and it is deforestation free before you're submitting it to the registry. But you also are getting an audit trail with a software solution. And so as you're collecting data, whether that's in the form of legality assessment or you're just collecting the geospatial data from your suppliers, you want to be able to track when this is happening, and track errors that are associated with it. So again, talked earlier about the ordering process and tying a due diligence statement back to the procurement flow. I think this is really important for companies to understand is that the penalties for incorrect data or data that has deforestation in it could result in financial penalties for the operator, for the trader. And so that's directly affecting your bottom line, your procurement process. So being able to connect all of these different pieces within your procurement process to the due diligence statement submission gives you a level of traceability and auditability that doing this process manually can't really perform. And again, if that's particularly important, if you do run into an issue and there is deforestation detected and you submit that due diligence statement, when the authorities come and start auditing your transactions, you want to have that data in a place where it's easily acceptable, and you can point to areas where you've taken mitigation steps with your suppliers. Having said that, you can track all of the transactions, you can verify all of the polygons and points that the suppliers are submitting, but I'll come back to the point that's been made earlier, which is working with your suppliers to understand their technical capability, their readiness, their ability to comply with a due diligence statement is really, right now, the most important thing that most companies can do until enforcement begins. And so understanding how exposed you are, what risks you have because your suppliers may not be capable of submitting this data accurately. That's the first big step. And so that's where supplier engagement, supplier outreach, and a program to educate and ultimately train your suppliers on how to do this properly is really, really important. And of course, software can support that. Software can give you the signals whether or not a supplier is able to comply, but it can't directly fix all of those problems. Although, without getting into too much of a technical detail, we can make some repairs to some polygon that are submitted incorrectly. But really, you want to address the problem up front at the source where the suppliers are collecting it.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you both. We do have some questions from the audience here that we could go through really quickly. Don't know who wants to take this one, but from an anonymous attendee, what do you recommend to smaller companies with less spending leverage over their supplier who is having trouble getting data from suppliers? So we've actually heard this from companies with large leverages over their suppliers as well. So I don't know, Juliette, what have you heard around from
Yeah.
industry?
So, and it's true. We also heard it from. It's true if you have a higher, bigger leverage, it's a little easier, especially when we want to renegotiate contracts, like I was mentioning. The thing to really bear in mind is that EUDR, it's not even for your suppliers, it's not a nice to have. And so, for example, if I'll use first the example of in the context of a small company, sorry, being a trader or an exporter, and then we can talk more about the import. But in the context of you being a small company, being a trader or an exporter, by law, your EU suppliers have to provide to you the due diligence receipt, the proof. The law doesn't necessarily say how they have to give it to you, so that's maybe where the negotiation comes in more. But by law, they have to, and they are in breach of compliance on their sides if they're not providing to you the DDR, the due diligence reference number that prove they imported the goods in respecting EUDR. So this is important also for you, but also for all your whole team to be educated as a company. It's not something not nice to have. When we're looking at them more as an importer, even if you're a smaller company, it's very likely that this supplier has to give polygons and data to their other customers. So I think it's also building that discussion. They may lose the contract with you if they're not able, but mostly they won't be able to import any goods to Europe if they're not able to provide geolocation data. And I think this is very important and key to educate, obviously, maybe your sustainability team, but even more, and your compliance team, even more your procurement team, so that everyone can have the same discussion with the suppliers around this. But that's more from a best practice of things you could do. From a system point of view, what's very important, whether you use Sourcemap or anyone else, is the EU has very specific attributes and data points. We talk a lot about geolocation, but it's also the HS code, the species, date of harvest. There's a very standard list. And so I think the key to make also the life easier of suppliers is to have it very standardized process, how you get that data, so that it's not in a different way depending on the type of product you purchase. And so from a Sourcemap standpoint, we've completely standardized the way we collect information for all our customers when it comes to EUDR. So it makes it easy for supplier to share information automatically. So reducing any kind of technology barrier. From a more engagement, best practice, definitely being able to not just have one or two people at your company educated, but everyone that is basically in touch with supplier or customer to be educated, so that again, it's not a nice to have, it's the law, and the penalty is pretty high, 4%, it's pretty high, and everyone in the supply chain is liable of that 4%, or at least everyone who is importing and everyone downstream from that is liable. So your supplier would be also liable if they don't respect the law.
And maybe as a follow-up from the Q&A here, someone asks, will a year be enough time for suppliers to mature enough to submit the necessary data for the EUDR?
I'll go for it,
Yeah.
Sean.
Okay. Yeah, I think it really is going to depend on your suppliers, but also how you're engaging with your suppliers. So I don't think we can tell you if that time is enough. For some suppliers, it's definitely enough time. For other suppliers, it might not be. But my recommendation would be start with the suppliers you have your closest relationships with, your top suppliers, your T1 suppliers, and assess, do they actually have the data required to be submitted in a due diligence statement? Do they have the geospatial data that's going to be required to report? If they don't have that information, then potentially you've got more work to do and more coordination with that supplier, which could include identifying those farms or those producers that actually do collect this information. So I guess the answer will be it depends, but the first step is always talking directly to your T1 suppliers who are selling you goods and understanding what their capabilities are and what their readiness is, and then making some decisions together about the next step if they're not prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're getting several questions here about, people's belief and the EU's ability to actually automatically check all of these DDS. And I think an anecdote that at Sourcemap we've experienced is we've actually had an opportunity to test some data with the EU. So John, could you explain sort of the testing that we cooperated with the EU on and how that sort of shows their capabilities to automatically actually review due diligence statements?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had an opportunity to submit actually geospatial data in the form of GeoJSON to the EU. That wasn't the EU registry. It wasn't online at that point, but it was to an email where they were going to use the same logic that they will employ once everyone starts accessing the registry. And we got some interesting feedback from them. We actually tried to break the system. So we gave them files that we felt were completely fine and deforestation free, and some files that had some technical problems. So maybe there were duplicates in the file, or there were some other issues associated with the geometries that we submitted, or may have contained deforestation. We were a little surprised. One is that they were actually rejecting the files that had problems in them. Some of the criteria that they were using to reject wouldn't necessarily have been our choice on how to identify. In this case, there were some duplicate records in the files, which from a GIS perspective may not have been technically duplicates, but it was a good validation for us to know that they are actually checking these files. They do employ a logic that checks to see if the data that's being submitted is accurate. and will be checked for deforestation. It does go back to the point around the global forest canopy, the EU observatory data set that they are using. How accurate will that be? I think time will tell when they issue the update to that data set. But at least from a geospatial data processing perspective, they clearly have an automated way of verifying whether this data is accurate, so that they can do that deforestation analysis.
Building on that, I think for the implication of that learning for us is that it means that, I mean, there's two things. It means that there is a risk that if an importer submits a due diligence statement and doesn't have the basic geolocation correct, duplicates or other things, there's a risk that that due diligence statement would be rejected automatically. And that's very big because that means then if you don't have a receipt, a DDR, you can't import. So the implication can be very, very important. We'll see if that's really pardon, how it's going to be, but that means the implication of that kind of automated validation that the EU would do, at least on data quality, could have a big impact for anyone that wants to submit a due diligence statement. And for context, as we are doing mapping and checking, data quality with our own customer, that's what they're doing, the baseline, the preparedness, readiness that we just discussed. Most of the issue we found is not about deforestation. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but actually the biggest risk our customer when they do readiness that they're seeing is either the supplier doesn't have that data or the data is bad quality. The deforestation, especially if you look after December 2020, which is the cutoff date for the law, is pretty low in our experience. However, the percentage rate of bad data or of suppliers not having that data is really where the biggest issue or the biggest challenges that our customer are really facing. And so that's why I think this basic understanding is so key, not only to make sure you have the data, but also that your due diligence statement, when you will submit it in the EU registry, will be accepted.
And we are coming at time here, but there are so many more questions we couldn't get to. Apologies about that. But if you had any extra questions you wanted to be followed up on, just email info@sourcemap.com. We'll answer as many as we can as fast as possible. But again, thank you to John, thank you to Juliette for really partaking in such an interesting conversation.